She was sent to the desert to be forgotten. Outpost Kestrel was less a military installation and more a purgatory of steel and sand, a place where careers went to die under the unforgiving glare of a sun that bleached the sky white. Her transfer orders had been stark, clinical. Technician, 4th class. Maintenance division. Her name, Alara, was just a line of text on a digital file, stripped of rank, of history, of significance. She had accepted it with the same quiet discipline that had defined her entire life. She signed the papers, packed a single duffel bag, and vanished into the anonymity the command structure had assigned her. To them, she was a problem solved, a loose end tucked away where she could cause no more ripples. To the men and women of Outpost Kestrel, she was just a ghost in grease-stained coveralls, a woman of indeterminate age with eyes that held the flat, calm emptiness of the horizon. She did not speak unless spoken to, and her replies were brief, functional things, devoid of warmth or curiosity. She was a cog, and she performed her function perfectly. The outpost was a testing ground for experimental technologies, which meant it was also a junkyard for ambitious failures. The air was thick with the arrogance of young pilots, all eager to make their mark, to prove their mettle on the newest, fastest machines. They saw Alara in the hangar, her hands moving with an economy and precision that should have been telling, but they saw only a woman, older than their mothers, doing a menial job. They dismissed her. Colonel Madsen, the base commander, had glanced at her file once upon her arrival. He saw the demotion, the transfer from a classified unit, the redactions that covered her service record like thick black scars. He saw a disciplinary case, a burnout. He assigned her to the hangar's most thankless task, maintaining the hangar queen, the Seraph 7. It was a beautiful, terrible machine, an experimental reconnaissance craft with a swept-wing design that looked more like a predator bird than an aircraft. It was a masterpiece of engineering, impossibly advanced and perpetually grounded by 1,000 tiny, unsolvable issues. It was the jewel of the outpost and its greatest frustration. The pilots, like the brash Lieutenant Jorik, called it the Ice Queen, stunning to look at, but untouchable and cold. They thought it a fitting assignment for the quiet, stoic woman who now tended to it. Alara did not mind. She found a strange peace in the Seraph silence. The other mechanics avoided it, frustrated by its complexities. But Alara learned its language. She spent her days tracing its fiber-optic veins, cleaning its delicate sensor arrays, listening to the subtle hum of its dormant power core. Her hands, slender but strong, moved with an innate understanding. She didn't consult manuals. She seemed to commune with the machine, sensing the imbalances in its systems like a doctor sensing a patient's fever. A young private, a boy named Chun with sharp eyes and a humble demeanor, was the first to notice. He watched her one afternoon as she worked on a standard-issue Falcon fighter that had been plagued by a persistent, phantom vibration at high altitude. 3 different teams had stripped the engine, run diagnostics, and found nothing. They'd grounded the pilot for a week, blaming his nerves. Alara walked over to the plane, her expression unreadable. She placed a hand on the fuselage, closing her eyes for a moment as if listening. Then she knelt, retrieved a single wrench, and tightened a hydraulic actuator coupling hidden deep within the landing gear assembly. She tightened it not with force, but with a specific measured torque, her wrist turning a precise quarter turn until she felt a click so faint it was more a feeling than a sound. She wiped her hands on a rag and walked away without a word. Chun, driven by curiosity, checked the maintenance logs. The actuator she had touched was listed as within tolerance. It shouldn't have been the problem. But the next day, the Falcon's pilot, cleared for flight, took it up and broke the base's speed record, reporting back that the aircraft flew smoother than the day it was delivered. He praised the official tech team. Alara's name was never mentioned. Chun saw her later that day, standing before the Seraph 7, her silhouette framed by the cavernous hangar door. He approached her cautiously. "Technician," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "The Falcon. How did you know?" Alara's gaze didn't shift from the Seraph. The harmonic resonance was off. she said, her voice low and even. The vibration wasn't from the engine. It was traveling through the frame from the landing gear strut. At speed, it felt like the engine was shaking itself apart. Chun stared. It was an explanation so simple and so brilliant that it made the other technicians' efforts look like clumsy guesswork. He looked at her not as a forgotten old woman, but as a master craftsman. From that day on, he watched her, learned from her, and kept her secrets. The institutional arrogance of the outpost was a fortress, and Alera's quiet competence was a silent siege. The pilots, led by the cocksure Jorik and his wingman Valerius, treated the high-tech simulators as their personal playgrounds. One morning, the Seraph 7's dedicated simulator, a machine as complex as the aircraft itself, began to malfunction. It was throwing pilots into uncontrollable spins, its haptic feedback system kicking with brutal, unpredictable force. Jorik emerged from the cockpit, pale and furious. "The damn thing is trying to kill me," he snared at Hayes, the civilian instructor. Hayes, a man whose pride was vested entirely in his expensive machines, ran a dozen diagnostics. "Everything is green, Lieutenant," he insisted, his tone defensive. "The calibration is perfect. Maybe the flight model is just too much for you." The insult hung in the air, thick and heavy. Jorik was the best pilot on the base, and he knew it. For the next hour, he and Valerius tried to tame the simulator, each attempt ending in a simulated crash and a fresh wave of frustration. Colonel Madsen arrived, his face a thundercloud. The simulator was a critical part of the program. Its failure was a mark against his command. "What is the problem, Hayes?" he demanded. "It's the pilots, Colonel," Hayes said, shifting the blame. "They can't handle the force feedback. The system is too responsive." Alera had been standing in the background, observing. Chen saw the subtle shift in her posture, a straightening of the spine, a flicker of something in her deep, calm eyes. She stepped forward. The room fell silent. Her presence was so consistently unobtrusive that her movement was a shock. "It's not the feedback strength," she said. Her voice cut through the tension with unnerving clarity. "The gyroscopic calibrators are distinct." Hayes scoffed, his face flushing with anger. "That's impossible. They're self-correcting. They've drifted," Alera stated, not as a theory, but as a fact. She walked past the stunned pilots and the fuming instructor and sat not in the pilot's seat, but the small maintenance terminal beside the simulator. Her fingers flew across the keypad, typing in command lines that weren't in any manual. The screen filled with scrolling code. She wasn't running a diagnostic. She was having a conversation with the machine's core logic. "The vertical and horizontal stabilizers are fighting each other," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "They're creating a feedback loop. It needs to be rebalanced." She entered a final command string. The violent hum of the simulator's hydraulic pumps softened into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The cockpit, which had been shuddering erratically, settled into perfect stillness. "Try now," she said, standing up and stepping back into the shadows. Jorik, his skepticism warring with a nascent sense of awe, climbed back into the cockpit. He strapped himself in, took the controls, and lifted the simulated craft off the runway. The movements were fluid, responsive, perfect. He flew for 10 minutes, executing maneuvers that had been impossible just a short while ago. When he emerged, he didn't look at Hayes or the colonel. He looked at Alera. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a look of profound confusion. "Who are you?" he asked, the question raw and direct. Alera simply met his gaze and then turned, walking out of the simulation room and back toward the hangar, back to her silent vigil over the real Seraph. She left a room full of powerful men, standing in stunned, uncomfortable silence. The first cracks in their fortress of dismissal had appeared. Madsen pulled up her file again that night. He stared at the black bars of redaction, but now they didn't look like disciplinary actions. They looked like armor. The desert's temperament was as fickle as it was brutal. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. A sandstorm, a hubbub of biblical proportions, swept in from the east with a speed that defied all meteorological predictions. The world outside the outpost vanished behind a churning wall of sand. The wind screamed, a physical force that made the steel buildings groan. Communications were severed almost instantly, the air so thick with static and particulates that even the most powerful signals were swallowed whole. Then the real emergency came. A frantic, broken message had gotten through just before the blackout. A long-range patrol, 2 vehicles with 8 soldiers, had suffered a catastrophic engine failure and was stranded 70 miles out, directly in the path of the storm's deadliest corridor. They had 3 hours of oxygen in their vehicle filters. After that, their lungs would fill with sand. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the outpost command center. Every conventional aircraft was grounded. The helicopters couldn't generate enough lift in the dense, turbulent air. The Falcon's engines would be scoured to ruin in seconds. They were blind, deaf, and helpless. The 8 soldiers were as good as dead. Madsen slammed his fist on the central console, his face ashen. "There has to be something," he growled, the words a prayer more than a command. "What about the Seraph?" It was Jorik who said it. Every head turned to him. "The Seraph 7 has shielded intakes, and its flight controls are neurolinked. It's designed to operate in hostile atmospheric conditions. It's a grounded prototype, Lieutenant." Hayes, the instructor, shot back. "It's never flown in a real-world mission. And who the hell is going to fly it? You crashed it 6 times in a perfect simulator. Out there, in that, it would tear you apart." Jorik's face was grim. He hated to admit it, but Hayes was right. The raw, untamed power of the Seraph, combined with the violence of the storm, was a death sentence for any pilot on the base. "He's right," Jorik said quietly, the admission costing him dearly. "None of us can handle it." A profound and terrible despair settled over the room. They were going to listen over a dead calm line as 8 of their own suffocated. And then, a voice, calm and steady, broke the silence. "I can fly it." It was Alara. She stood at the doorway, her coveralls immaculate, her face serene. She had walked from the hangar through the howling wind as if it were a mild breeze. Madsen stared at her, incredulity warring with desperation. For a moment, he thought grief was making him hallucinate. "Technician," he began, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is not the time for," he trailed off, unsure of what he was even accusing her of. Delusion? A sick joke? Before he could dismiss her, before he could order her out of his command center, something miraculous happened. A single speaker on the comms panel, one thought to be dead, crackled to life. A voice, distorted by static, but clear and authoritative, cut through the noise. It was a priority signal, somehow punching through the storm on a hyper-encrypted frequency. "Kestrel Command, this is Central. We picked up your distress beacon. What is your status?" Madsen lunged for the microphone. "Central Command, this is Colonel Madsen. We have a patrol stranded. 0 visibility, all aircraft grounded." "We're out of options." There was a pause, then the voice came back. "We have an asset on site. The Seraph 7 prototype. Is it flight-worthy?" "It is, but we have no qualified pilots." "Central," Madsen replied, his hopes sinking again. It was then that Jorik, his eyes still locked on Alara, spoke with a sudden, dawning certainty. "Sir," he said to Madsen, but his words were for the speaker. "Technician Alara says she can fly it." The name, spoken into the encrypted channel, changed everything. The silence from the other end was brief, but charged with significance. Then the voice came back, and all distortion was gone. It was sharp, commanding, and laced with a tone of utter disbelief. "Colonel, confirm the name of that technician." "Alara, sir." "Technician 4th Class, Alara." Another pause, shorter this time. "Colonel Madsen," the voice said, and it was now imbued with an almost reverential gravity. "I am Commander Thorne of Special Operations Command. If the person on your base is Alara, you will address her by her proper title, and you will give her anything she asks for. Is Whisperhawk on site?" The call sign echoed in the silent room like a thunderclap. Whisperhawk. It wasn't just a name. It was a ghost story, a legend whispered in hushed tones by elite pilots and special forces operators. A pilot who could fly anything, anywhere, who had pulled off missions so impossible they were officially denied. a name associated with the most advanced, most secret aircraft ever built. Jorik and the other pilots looked at Alara, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and dawning comprehension. The quiet mechanic, the woman who fixed their simulators and calibrated their engines. Colonel Madsen felt the floor drop out from under him. He looked at Alara, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the quiet confidence that he had mistaken for apathy, the discipline he had mistaken for subservience. She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the fire banked deep within her eyes. She slowly, deliberately pulled off one of her work gloves. On the back of her hand, just below the knuckles, was a tattoo. It was a stylized hawk, its wings swept back in a silent, predatory dive. Thorne's voice crackled over the speaker again, a direct order. "Colonel, get Whisperhawk in the air." Now, Madsen could only nod, his authority dissolving in the presence of a living legend. "Clear her for takeoff," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Give her whatever she needs." The hangar, which had been Alara's sanctuary of quiet labor, transformed into a theater of urgent purpose. As she walked toward the Seraph 7, the pilots and ground crew parted before her like a tide. The mockery and dismissal had been replaced by a stunned, focused reverence. Jorik, his face etched with humility, was the first to act. "What do you need, ma'am?" he asked, the honorific coming naturally to his lips. "Power it up," Alara said, her tone unchanged. "Full systems check. Arm the forward particle cannons and load a single EM pulse missile." Her requests were calm, precise, and utterly confident. As the ground crew scrambled to obey, she began her pre-flight check, her movements a blur of practiced efficiency. She didn't use a checklist. The checklist was etched into her soul. She ran her bare hand along the Seraph's fuselage, a final, silent communion with her partner. The machine seemed to respond, its internal lights flickering to life, its systems humming a song of readiness. Strapped into the cockpit, she was no longer a forgotten technician. She was enthroned. The canopy hissed shut, sealing her in a world of glowing displays and the low thrum of contained power. The Neuralink helmet descended, and as its sensors made contact with her temples, the cockpit displays shifted, mirroring her thoughts. To the stunned observers in the control tower, it was magic. To Alara, it was breathing. "Kestrel Tower, this is Whisperhawk." Her voice came over the comms, clear and steady. "Requesting immediate takeoff, any runway." Madsen, watching from the tower window, found his voice. "The runways are blind, Whisperhawk. You have zero visibility. I don't need a runway," she replied. The Seraph's engine spooled up, not with a roar, but with a deep, pulsating thrum that vibrated in the bones. The aircraft lifted straight up, its advanced vectored thrust holding it steady in the maelstrom. It hovered for a moment, a dark angel against the swirling brown chaos, and then it shot forward, vanishing into the wall of sand as if it were diving into water. The silence it left behind was absolute. In the cockpit, the world outside was an opaque tempest, but Alara wasn't flying by sight. She was flying by feel, by the intricate data streaming directly into her consciousness from the Seraph sensor arrays. The storm was not an obstacle. It was a landscape. She saw the pressure waves, the wind shears, the pockets of turbulence, not as threats, but as currents to be navigated. The Seraph moved with a grace that defied the violence around it. Pilot and machine fused into a single, purpose-driven entity. She located the stranded patrol's heat signature within minutes, a faint bloom of warmth in the cold, churning chaos. They were huddled in their powerless vehicle, their time running out. As she banked the Seraph to begin her descent, a new signal flared on her tactical display. It was faint, heavily shielded, and it wasn't from the patrol. It was a military-grade energy signature, powering up less than 2 clicks from the stranded soldiers. Her mind processed the data with cold, lethal speed. The signature was consistent with the final arming sequence of a mobile launch platform. The enemy wasn't just a local insurgency. They were a sophisticated force. And they weren't using the storm as cover for a conventional attack. The radiation spike, though minute, was unmistakable. They were using the storm's chaos to deploy a tactical nuclear weapon. The target was Outpost Kestrel. The stranded patrol wasn't the mission. They were bait. The enemy had gambled that the outpost would be focused on a rescue, blind and deaf to the greater threat preparing to wipe them from existence. A cold certainty settled in Alara's gut. There was no time to warn the base. Comms were still a mess. There was no time to fly back. The launch was imminent. She had one aircraft, one chance. Rescue the patrol, and the base would be annihilated. Destroy the launcher, and the 8 soldiers would suffocate in the sand. It was an impossible choice, a scenario designed to guarantee failure. But Alara's mind did not deal in failure. It dealt in solutions. Her gaze swept over her weapons display. Particle cannons, an EM pulse. Not enough to vaporize the launcher, but enough to cripple it if she could get close enough. But the launcher would have point defense systems. A direct approach was suicide. She needed a distraction. She needed to do both. Her thoughts moved faster than the aircraft. She angled the Seraph into a steep dive, skimming the desert floor, using the terrain itself to mask her approach. She flew directly over the stranded patrol's vehicle, the roar of her engines the first sign of hope they'd had in hours. She didn't stop. She pushed the Seraph to its limits, accelerating toward the launch site. The enemy, seeing her fly past the bait, would assume she hadn't detected them. They would proceed with the countdown. She had seconds. Banking hard, she came around in a wide, silent arc, approaching the launcher from its rear quadrant, its blind spot. The launch vehicle was a massive, armored transport, its missile already raised in a firing position. The countdown timer, which she could read from the heat radiating off its display panel, showed 45 seconds. Too far for the cannons. She had one shot with the EM pulse, but it had to be perfect. She couldn't just disable it. She had to trigger a catastrophic overload in its power systems, something that would ignite the conventional propellant of the missile on the pad. She angled the Seraph's nose up, a move no pilot would ever make. She was deliberately stalling the aircraft, bleeding off speed until she was practically hovering, held aloft only by the sheer power of her thrusters and the will of her mind. She became a stable weapons platform in the heart of a hurricane. The countdown hit 15 seconds. The enemy still hadn't seen her. Her targeting computer locked on. The target wasn't the missile. It was the unshielded power conduit running from the truck's reactor to the launch gantry. It was the size of a dinner plate. "Breathe," she whispered to herself. The Seraph was an extension of her body. Her calm was its stability. She squeezed the trigger. The EM missile shot out, a silent streak of light that was instantly swallowed by the sandstorm. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then a brilliant, silent flash lit up the swirling brown curtain in front of her. A secondary explosion followed, a deep, concussive whump that she felt through the Seraph's frame. It was a conventional blast, the missile's fuel cooking off. The nuclear core, its trigger mechanism fried by the EM pulse, remained inert. The threat was gone. Without pausing, Alara threw the Seraph into a tight, gut-wrenching turn and raced back toward the patrol. She landed beside their vehicle with a delicacy that seemed impossible for such a powerful machine. The canopy hissed open, and the 8 soldiers, their faces masked but their eyes wide with disbelief, stared at the angel who had descended from the storm. She didn't speak. She just pointed toward the Seraph's small emergency personnel bay. They scrambled aboard, no questions asked. The return to Outpost Kestrel was as silent as the departure. The storm was beginning to break, the wall of sand receding, revealing a sky the color of a fresh bruise. As the Seraph 7 descended toward the main runway, Alara saw that the entire base had assembled to watch. Every pilot, every mechanic, every soldier stood in the dissipating wind, their faces turned upward. She landed the aircraft with the gentleness of a falling leaf. The engines spooled down into silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The outpost was frozen in a state of collective awe. Then the canopy opened. Alara swung her legs over the side of the cockpit and dropped to the tarmac. She was just a woman in a flight suit, her face streaked with sweat, her hands covered in grease. The 8 rescued soldiers disembarked, their relief palpable. Colonel Madsen was the first to move. He walked toward her, his stride no longer arrogant, but hesitant, humbled. He stopped a few feet away, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. The man who commanded a fortress of steel and pride was speechless. Technician, commander, Alara, he stammered, the titles colliding in his throat. He didn't know how to address the woman who had just saved them all from 2 different kinds of death. It was Jorik who found the right response. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Alara, his face stripped of all its youthful vanity. He saw her not as a rival or a mystery, but as the standard, the pinnacle of what a pilot could be. He drew himself to attention and rendered a salute so sharp, so precise. It was a physical expression of his shattered pride and newfound respect. "Ma'am," he said, the word a vow. One by one, the other pilots followed his lead. Valerius, Hayes, the entire command staff. They stood on the tarmac, their arms raised in a silent, unified tribute. Alara looked at them, her expression calm, her eyes holding the deep, quiet wisdom of the desert itself. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was not a gesture of triumph, but of closure. She did not want their praise or their apologies. She had done her duty. She turned away from them, away from the salutes and the awestruck stares, and walked back to the Seraph 7. She placed her bare hand on its still-warm fuselage, a silent thank you to her partner. The grease on her skin mingled with the dust on its hull. Then, without a backward glance, she walked toward the hangar, her shadow stretching long in the fading light. She left behind a command staff standing in reverent silence, their world remade, their perception shattered. They were no longer looking at a forgotten technician, but at the quiet, indelible mark of greatness that had just passed through their lives and saved them from oblivion.